welcome to Served Up. This podcast is where hospitality meets leadership and where we take an honest look at the business of beverage. I'm Bridget Albert. I've spent my career building cocktail programs, mentoring rising talent, judging competitions, and advocating for women in our industry. I'm joined by my co-host, Eric Heemer, one of only 5 people in the world to hold both the Master Sommelier and Master of Wine titles. His depth of knowledge and global perspective brings tremendous insight to every conversation. This is Served Up.
Welcome to Served Up. Today, Bridget and I talk to Karen MacNeil, professional wine speaker and entertainer and author of The Wine Bible, one of the most widely read and admired books on wine in existence, with over 1 million copies sold since the initial publication in 2001. We touch upon Karen's humble beginnings in the world of wine and her amazing career path since then. We also talk about Come Over October, a national campaign encouraging wine lovers to invite friends, colleagues, and family to come over during the month of October to share some wine at home, in a restaurant, at an outdoor event, or wherever friends and family gather. So grab a glass of your favorite wine, draw up a chair, sit back and relax, and enjoy the conversation. Cheers. Karen, welcome to the show. We're very, very happy to have you here on Served Up.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Bridget.
Well, thank you. We're looking forward to an interesting conversation. I've been really looking forward to this interview for quite some time. So let's go ahead and get started. And I always like to start with some background information, a little bit about you. Where are you from? What was your entree into the wine business? When did you get the bug? Tell us all about your past.
Gosh, that is a big question.
Well, maybe not all about your past, but give us the high points.
Yeah. I spent much of my early life in Reno, Nevada, actually slightly outside of Reno, but I moved to New York at 19 to try and become a writer. Unlike a lot of people who ultimately begin writing about wine, I did not have parents or family members who, when I was 11, let me taste, a little sip of their Grand Cru from their cellar. I started drinking wine at 15 while I was doing my homework. And it was, as I very fondly remember, 89-cent Bulgarian Red, which I adored. I couldn't believe that the rest of the world hadn't discovered these wines as I had. And I could drink wine at 15 because I had just months before that run away from home. And so I was off on my own journey from that moment on. And I suppose, just to make a long story short, from 89-cent Bulgarian Reds, I graduated into fizzy fuchsia pink Lancers and jugs of California Taylor California Cellar Chablis, which of course did not have a drop of Chablis in it. And, very bone thin but spaghetti happy Chianti in straw covered bottles. And so it was a very long way, I'll say, to the top of drinking some of the greatest wines in the world. But I kind of like that. In fact, I love the fact that I started very humbly with wine.
Yeah, I think you paid your dues, as they say. Yeah, not all of us can start off drinking Grand Cru Burgundy. I wish I had a wealthy grandfather who laid down a cellar of great Bordeaux and Burgundy for me, but unfortunately that didn't happen for me either. So I have similar background of drinking wine, and it's amazing that you would start with a Bulgarian Red, which still to this day, I think, as a wine country, struggles to get recognition here in the States.
Yeah, I'll tell you why I started there, because as a young woman who was, mind you, of course, underage, I was too afraid to walk completely into a wine store. And the wine store that was in my neighborhood, which was not a very good neighborhood, but it had a for sale bin in the very front of the store. It took me years of courage to get up the nerve to actually go fully into a wine store. So I just bought whatever was in the $1 and under bin in the front of the store.
Oh, that's a great story. That's amazing. So I'm assuming the drinking age, I should never assume anything, but the drinking age was probably 18 at the time.
You know, I don't even know what it was. In all honesty, I've never been carded. You know, I would, as a young woman might, I would put my hair up in a bun, put on red lipstick, and hope for the best. And I was lucky in that way.
I guess so.
By the way, to anyone listening, if you are under 21, this is not an invitation to go and drink wine.
That's right. That wouldn't be responsible. Well, that's an interesting startup. So obviously maybe not obviously to everybody, but you're famous in the wine world and to us as being the author of the Wine Bible, which is certainly one of the most widely read and admired books on wine in existence. But what led up to you becoming a writer? What else did you do before this?
When I began, when I moved to New York, I was trying to write about everything. I was writing about culture and women's issues and politics. And at that time, you would write an article and you would put it in an envelope with a return envelope enclosed, and you would mail it out to editors hoping to get published. And so in that way, I collected 324 rejection slips, all of which I thumbtacked to my 5th floor walk-up in Spanish Harlem in New York. And I tried not to get demoralized, but that's a lot of rejection, of course. Tried not to get too demoralized by that. And one day, you know, I was still drinking really inexpensive wine, and I loved food. I was cooking every day. New York was, of course, wonderful in terms of inexpensive ethnic restaurants. So one day I thought to myself, and I was so poor, by the way, I was on food stamps. So one day looking at these rejection slips, I thought to myself, oh, I have this brilliant idea. I should start trying to write about food, because maybe when you write about food, people would give you samples. And this was my bright idea for my food stamp diet. So I started trying to write about food. And the first article I ever sold was on butter. It was to the Village Voice. I got paid $30, best $30 ever. I immediately went out to the hip nightclub in New York, sat at the bar, bought an entire bottle of champagne, and drank a whole thing. It was my first taste of champagne, and it was, you know, incredible. So that with food writing, actually with a lot of writing, you know, you just need one break that you can then build on. So butter was my big break. And over the next few years, I became a pretty well-known food writer. I was writing for all the top magazines, writing for the New York Times, and I had published a book on food with Random House. But secretly, in my heart of hearts, what I always wanted to write about was wine. But wine is, of course, almost impossible to begin to write about because, unlike food, you really, with wine, have to have access. You have to be able to taste a lot. And when I began, there were no, you know, things like WSET, Wine and Spirits Education Trust, was not yet in the United States. There were only a few wine schools in the whole country. Most of the big books were by British authors and very difficult to read if you were starting out. Nothing made sense. And there was no way to break into tastings. I was a young woman. All of the wine communications world was controlled by about 5 men in New York, and they They did all of the tastings. They wrote for every magazine, every newspaper about wine. And, the Bordelaise would fly in, the Chianti Classico producers, the port producers, and they would do these elaborate tastings for just these 5 men. And one of these men was a friend of mine. They were all significantly older than me, but he knew how much I wanted to taste really good wine. And so he decided that he would ask the others if I could come with him to these tastings. And they took a vote. And the vote was that I could on one condition, that I not talk.
Oh, my.
And I tasted with these men for years and never said a word. I didn't want to give my opinion, by the way. As far as I was concerned, I didn't know enough to give my opinion. So it was a different time, you really were kind of silent if you were the young woman in the room. But I did want to ask questions. And so not being allowed to talk was really sad from that perspective. But and it's unthinkable now to any young woman would be horrified by this idea. But there's a kind of a good ending in the sense that I remembered so clearly everything that was confusing, every question I had. And all of those confusing questions became in a sense, the emotional basis, the content for the Wine Bible. And when the Wine Bible came out, it was radically different than any British book. First of all, it was the first big book written by an American author. And also it had a sensibility. I was on the reader's side. I too remembered what it was like to not know, why is red wine red? Mm. So I wrote with a very different ferociousness of mastering an idea, mastering the whole world of wine.
Oh, that's amazing. What a fantastic story. And I think many people that have read your book and used your book over the years would agree that yours was the first book that was really entertaining. It wasn't an encyclopedia, a pedantic, tome that weighed 5 pounds like some of the British books that you referenced. And that's what I think that's what made it immediate appealing, was that you could feel your passion and it was entertaining to read. And those two things kept you glued to the pages. What a great winning formula.
Well, I'm sure the three of us would agree that what makes wine so rich is that it is threaded into a complex tapestry of food and religion and history and art. And the big British books at the time had stripped all of that out. And so it was just sort of gray paragraph after gray paragraph of wine. And even if you are more, passionate about wine than the average bear, as I was, it was still pretty deftly reading. And so for me, it made complete sense to thread all that stuff back in, because that's what makes wine fascinating to begin with.
Yeah, it sure does. I have a question for you, just being a female author in the wine space, and you created this brilliant book. And, like we're talking about here, being from the United States, and you were really able to strike a balance between being that ultimate reference book, right, for wine, but then also keeping your voice. Can you talk about that? And what did that feel like for you throughout the process of writing the Wine Bible?
For most people, when they sit down to write, their mind switches into writing mode, and they write in a way that they think you are supposed to write. And I decided early on that I would write as if I was talking the book to someone. And the whole time that I wrote the first edition of the Wine Bible, by the way, it took 10 years to do, 10 unpaid years. And most people do not work on a project for no pay for 10 years. And actually, no, I had no expectation that the book would sell. I I thought maybe, 25 copies for, sympathetic friends would buy it, and that would be it. But the whole time that I was writing, I pictured a person, the same person, in front of me. She was about 40 years old, knew nothing about wine, but was a smart person, a thoughtful person. And I told her the story of wine around the world, including funny little asides. How many sheep there are for every winemaker in New Zealand. I mean, there was nothing that was, not a possible topic, because I knew that for me, it had also been true, and it still is true, that it's all those fascinating little asides that bring wine to life, that make you chuckle, that give you an insight into a culture. And that was important to me. So I've always written in a very conversational voice. And, now I do a digital newsletter, a weekly digital newsletter called Wine Speed. And it's a great also example of that. I'm right. You could read it as if you were talking with a friend on the street. The words would not be different. It's written as a conversation.
That's amazing. I was reading a little bit about that too, and perhaps you can tell our listeners, where you can access or how to access Wine Speed and any other publications or blogs that you're doing right now. That would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Well, Wine Speed is easy. It's just one word, wine and speed. And it's named up because it's really speedy to read. You can, we send it to your inbox every Friday, and you can just go to winespeed.com and sign up. It's pretty fun. It has a wine quiz every week. Every week I get emails from people all over the world like, oh my God, I got the wine quiz right this week, or wrong. People take it very strongly. And it's full of just fascinating information. I absolutely believe that learning about wine, and we're all learners, right? We're all constantly on that gerbil wheel of learning, that it should be fun. It should be fascinating. It should be galvanizing. You should say to yourself as you're reading along, wow, that's so interesting. I didn't know that. And so my writing is always infused with, I didn't know that's.
Yeah, those little aha moments that are so exciting. Me too. And I've been doing this nearly as long as you have, maybe even a little longer, dating myself a little bit, but still every day I learn something new about wine has been a great day, and it's changing so rapidly these days. There's always something new and exciting to learn about, as well as the classic things that we take for granted that your readers and listeners might, find to be brand new and refreshing. And that's the beautiful thing about it. It's always changing. It's always innovative, and what's old is new again. And it's amazing. And we could wax on about that for a long time, but along those same lines, we're jaded veterans here, but I still get excited when I discover a new wine or a new wine region. And I wanted to ask you, what wine regions are currently exciting you the most? Not necessarily the trendiest, but maybe the most authentic, compelling, interesting things to you. What are you drinking these days, Karen?
Well, I'm coming to you from my office in Napa Valley, and we taste in this office, I have a small staff, we taste about 2,000 wines a year. So a lot of what I'm drinking is what I'm tasting to write about. But, I think that two things are always operating. One is, yes, what is new and fascinating? English sparkling wine, let's say. Delicious, absolutely sensational, new, exciting. But also, I love it when something that you used to like a long time ago comes around and you begin to see it again in a new light because you yourself have changed. So sometimes, just tasting a really delicious Bordeaux, I'm like, oh my God, I get why Bordeaux is so fantastic, right? And I think it's sad when people have only a linear trajectory that they proceed along. And they're like, oh, yeah, I used to drink that when I was in my 20s, and then I drank that when I was in my 30s, but now I'm on to the newest thing. To me, I don't think it's like that. I think it's a circle. And you fall in love with new things, but you also re-fall in love with things you started out loving.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I was, like many people, I started off, well, maybe not like many people. I think today, more often than not, if you're a red wine drinker here in the United States, your first introduction will be to California red wines, naturally. But back in the 70s, when I first started drinking wine, Bordeaux was the king, the queen. It was our be-all, end-all red wine. And I didn't know much else. And of course, I was drinking the Bordeauxs of the 70s that were 12% alcohol and higher acid, and very, very different than what developed, just a decade or so later for many, many reasons. But it's really heartening to me today to hear younger people talking about these classic regions like Bordeaux. It's funny, just the other day, I was talking to a young physical therapist, and we got onto the topic of wine naturally, as we all do. What do you do for a living? And she showed me a picture of a bottle of Domaine de Chevalier 2020 that her friend had given her. I'm like, wow, there is hope after all. And she said, is this expensive? And I said, well, what do you consider expensive? And I gave her some suggestions for some other wines, some Haut-Médoc appellated wines that were more along her, in her budget. And she was super excited. So to see younger people embracing Bordeaux, again, after all the woes that some of the have-nots in Bordeaux have had to go through, lately, it's very heartening to me to see that as well. What's come around again full circle. And for me, I think German Riesling was another category that, in the 80s, I worked in a restaurant that had a Cruvenet system, and we always had at least not one, but two German Rieslings. You can't just have a Cabernet. We have to have an Auslese too, it's that sort of thing. And then it sort of fell out of fashion, and now it's back again. So it's a beautiful merry-go-round of wine that we live in, and it makes me happy every day to get out of bed and go to work.
I love Riesling too. And poor Riesling, though, it's been on the cusp of arriving for, 60 years. But went back a century and looked at New York wine lists in the 1800s. German Riesling, specifically Rheingau Riesling, sold for more than first growth Bordeaux. So Germany has always, at least in the last 300 years, been among the greatest wine regions in the world.
Yeah, it's very true. I too remember seeing some of those, not even that old, but as early as the 1960s, and the only wines on the list were European, and they were French and German. There was no sign of Italy yet, and very few other wines were on the list. Nobody had even heard of Australian wine, or you had to have inside information to taste some of those other wines. But it is true. I wanted to ask you a little bit about a topic that's relevant to everybody in the wine industry, and that is climate change. And I'm sure you get asked about this all the time, but do you have any insight as to where you feel classic regions will be affected with climate change in the future? And that could be 10 years, 50 years down the road. How is that going to change things stylistically? What's your inside opinion on that?
I'm worried. As I mentioned, I'm coming to you from Napa Valley, where in the last, I would say, 8 years, I've evacuated 4 times because of wildfires. Just this past year, in February, of all things, all of a sudden, we had a week of 90-degree temperatures. The erraticness of climate is, I think, an enormous concern, because when something is erratic, then you can't even plan for that. And, God knows wineries are dealing with agriculture, nature. They can't turn on a dime. They have to be able to plan years ahead. And so when the climate is as mercurial as it is now, it's really unsettling. I would say one area gives me hope, and that is, of all things, Portugal. Because when you go to southern Portugal and you take where it's really hot and has been really hot for a long time, and you taste white wines there, you think, how on earth could these white wines be fresh and alive and have a lot of vitality? And I've asked scores of Portuguese winemakers and viticulturalists when I'm there, how can this be? These wines should be dead on arrival, in a sense. They should be overripe. They should be low in acidity. And the only thing they can point to is the adaptive ability of grapevines. That grapevines not only have been around for hundreds of thousands of years, as we know, but that vines are very adaptive to the environment. So I'm hoping that the grape regions, Bordeaux, Burgundy, Tuscany, Napa Valley, all the classic regions that we think of, and all of those in the next tier as well, will be able to benefit from this amazing adaptive ability of grapevines. But it's maybe a Pollyanna-esque view. I don't know what else we can hang our hats on, though.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that what you said was completely brilliant, because we do need to change folks' mind that don't believe in climate change or just think that it's, just something that people are making up to either find new funding ways or find a place to blame on their production, whatever it might be. And so what I think that you said is really important. I don't believe that it's Pollyanna. In fact, I think that we should all be talking about it much more than we do.
It's certainly we currently there are so many discussions about all of the challenges facing the wine industry. But boy, the biggest one of those is in neon, pulsating neon in front of us, which is what's happening with the climate. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. And with that said, what are some misconceptions about wine? Do you find yourself just wanting to maybe gently or firmly correct?
Well, I think one of the biggest misconceptions right now, and it's hard to know where this occurred, but is that wine has a lot of sugar. I want to go crazy every time I hear that, right? Oh, in fact, I was recently in Texas and love Texas. Hello, Texans. I love you. But anyway, I'm standing there and the people in front of me who I was talking with, who I had just met, had, red Solo cups. And I said, so what's in your cup? And they said, tequila. And I said, oh, why are you drinking tequila? Why do you love it? And they said, because it's so clean and it's so pure and it doesn't have sugar. I said, okay, but what has sugar? And they're like, well, wine. And I said, just out of curiosity, how much sugar do you think wine has? So there were 4 people in front of me, and the ranges went from 11% to 50%.
Oh my God.
Oh my
And
God.
I said, okay, you have to believe me on this. I really know what I'm doing. And wine does not have sugar. And I thought to myself, how can these otherwise very accomplished, smart adults, how did this misperception thread its way into the culture? But it's widespread now. I mean, I get probably at least once a week a comment from someone saying, oh, I just don't drink wine because it has so much sugar. And, Wine Market Council, the research group, has done a lot of great research on this, showing that something like 30% of the adults, which is a big percentage, who believe that wine has sugar in it, also believe that it's like aspartame that is added, or saccharin that's added to wine.
It's so bizarre.
Not the case. So there's that very top of mind. What other misperceptions? I think another misperception is that all Napa Valley wine is the same. I mean, I want to just, strangle East Coast sommeliers when I hear them say that, because not all Napa Valley wine is the same. So that's a huge misperception. What else is a good misperception? Let me keep thinking about that as we're talking.
Yeah, you keep thinking about that, because I do also want to ask you, like, the flip side of that. What excites you the most that's happening in wine right now? What's just really coming alive and giving you energy?
Well, Bridget, part of the answer is in your question, which is, I think more than ever, people are valuing a sense of aliveness in wine. And until very recently, many people approached wine in this very standardized way and look at the color, swirl it, smell it, taste it, write your notes, which I think it's certainly not the way I go about tasting wine. I'm not even looking at that stuff. The first thing I'm thinking about is this wine alive? Does it have a sense of energy, a sense that a kind of lit from within quality? Because that's what makes great wine great, above all, regardless of where it's from. And not one region, not one grape variety has a lock on that idea. And great wine from all over the world has this quality that is hard to define, but easy to sense. And to me, that's very exciting. And I continue to watch research that attempts to show where that sense of aliveness in wine comes from. It may be that we'll never know, but one of the best things about wine is not knowingness, is its mystery. I mean, when people say, I want to demystify wine, I say to myself, oh, please don't. Are you kidding? The minute you demystify it, it will be vodka. Forget about that. I love the mystery of wine. That's one of the hallmarks that makes wine different than everything else. It should be unknowing in many ways.
Well, that's a perfect segue, Karen, to talk about the next topic that I'd really like to get into, and that's near and dear to, obviously, your heart and ours at Southern Glazers, too, and that, of course, is the campaign for Come Over October. And I'd like you to tell our listeners a little bit about what it is and the inception, how you came up with this. And I think it's a fascinating story, so please share that with us, if you will.
Sure. Well, Come Over October and its sister campaign, Share and Pair Sundays, are the largest grassroots campaigns for wine, pro-wine, that have ever existed. Last year, we reached 2.9 billion media impressions, billion with a B.
Wow, that's amazing.
It was an idea of mine one morning in the beginning of 2024. And I was, of all things, walking my dog, and I was muttering to myself, why isn't the wine industry telling its own best story? It was the beginning of a cycle of a lot of bad news about lowered consumption. And I kept thinking, the wine industry isn't standing up for itself. And as I'm muttering this to myself, I'm very prone, I suppose, to do this. I kind of turned that around in my mind, and I said to myself, well, you're in the wine business. You should do something. So as I was walking along, I began to imagine, what would it be like if everybody in the whole country did something very simple, very natural, which is just invite someone over to share some wine. A friend, a family member, a neighbor, a colleague, just a very simple, humble act that has been performed for 8,000 years. Just invite someone over to share some wine. And because I'm a writer, I loved the rhyme of Come Over October. And so I thought, wow, this could be good. But I called Gino Colangelo and Kimberly Charles, two old friends who are have their own marketing and PR agencies, and said, so I just had this idea, and, you're in communications. What do you think? Is this like a terrible idea, or is this a good idea? And I knew that they would say to me, take an aspirin and go back to bed if it was like a bad idea. And they both said, ooh, this could be good. And so within 24 hours, the three of us had formed a little company called Come Together, a community for wine. We donate all of our time to it. So this is a pro bono effort on my part. It's not a money-making vehicle. We did raise last year, and thank you, Southern Glaciers, for being one of our biggest supporters. We raised collectively about $250,000 from around the world. And all of that money went into campaigns, grassroots campaigns around the country. Last year, more than 1,400 retail stores launched Come Over October promotions. And, dozens and dozens of wineries, in fact, every part of the wine business participated. And so it was great, because the premise of it is simply that, is that wines, the best thing about it is that it brings people together. It's intentionally a beverage meant to be shared. That's one of the reasons it's also been the beverage of religion, because it has that ability to connect us. You don't sit and drink it separately as you might a cocktail or a beer. You share the same bottle. And that is emotionally and psychologically very important. So it's been incredibly successful. And we are right in the middle of Share and Pair Sundays right now, 2026. It'll lead us into Come Over October 2026. And so it's really easy for everyone listening to participate. Just grab a friend and invite them over.
Grab a friend, open a bottle, share some food, share some conversation. Yeah. I think Robert Mondavi had it all right back in the day with his mission statement. It pretty much summed it all up right there. It's a healthful mealtime beverage as recommended in the Bible, and it's been around with us for centuries and has inspired statesmen and poets and wine writers, for centuries. And it's still one of the most natural alcoholic beverages. And that's to your point about the tequila and the red cup, which is I'm still shaking my head over that. It's a puzzler why people think wine is this unnatural thing. It's the product of nature. It's an agricultural product with a few very, very little additives whatsoever, a little sulfur dioxide to keep it from oxidizing, and that's about it. So I really, really love the campaign. And as you mentioned, Southern's been a big supporter. We're all trying to find that voice in the industry where, we can talk to younger generations in particular who seem to be, one of the leading causes for people drinking less wine and have all the misinformation out there that they get from social media. And it drives me crazy too. So along those lines, what role do you believe restaurants and sommeliers play today in shaping wine culture and encouraging some of these younger folks to enjoy wine with a meal? I know that, the cost is a big factor for young people. What are some things that you see from your perspective, Karen?
Well, certainly restaurants and wine buyers and sommeliers have a really important leading role in getting people excited about wine. It's like, remember that scene in When Harry Met Sally, and she's like, and people are like, I'll have what she's having.
Sure.
Right? Passion is contagious. When you see someone who is excited about something, you're like, wow, let me in on this too. So when you are in a restaurant, when you work in restaurants in any capacity, your ability by virtue of your own passion to turn someone else on is huge. It's everything. That's exactly how the wine industry has always operated for 8,000 years. People have been excited, and their own excitement gets somebody else excited. So what's important is to remember that the power of wine is individual. It's not in giant organizations with thousands of employees. As important as wine companies are, each individual has the capacity to get somebody else excited. And that thread, that spider web of passion has been the critical way in which wine has always functioned. So I'm happy about that. And it can happen both personally, it can happen over social media. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff about wine and social media too, which I love because it's full of, hopefully, the best social media on wine is full of excitement. You know, it's always been fascinating to me that when you ask someone, what was the greatest wine you ever had, or a wine that was pivotal, really important to you, everyone remembers who they were with when they had that wine. That's an interesting psychological fact when you think about that, right? I mean, you really see the importance of human connection and wine and human passion and in wine. Yeah, I think it's important for all of us to remember just how much power we have to make someone else's life so much more interesting by turning them on to great flavor.
That's true. So very true. Thank you for that. And it reminds me of a famous old quote about people maybe not remembering exactly who they were with or where, but the wine that they had, and it was, I forget the place, I forget the name of the girl, but the wine was Chambertin. one of my favorite quotes of all time, or sayings anyway. Well, thank you for that, Karen. And this has been a fascinating conversation. We all appreciate so much your initiative and vision in leading the campaign for Come Over October and all of the other campaigns that you're working with under Come Together, a Community for Wine, and Gino and Kimberly and all the other people that work with you. Thank you. Hats off. Amazing accomplishments that you've managed to create. And I think it's working. I'm hearing more and more people, younger people starting to talk a little bit about wine in a good, positive fashion. So that's fantastic. And would you like to tell our listeners where they can acquire their very own copy of the Wine Bible?
Absolutely. Well, of course, like all books, it's sold everywhere that you can buy books. But if you want a signed and personalized copy, you can also go to my website, which is karenmacneil.com. And there you can buy a copy for yourself, which I'll sign and personalize, a copy for a friend. Of course, the Wine Bible is a great gift, and it's really just easy to do. So jump on karenmacneil.com and you'll see, click on Buy the Wine Bible.
And there you have it. Thank you. Well, thanks again, Karen. It's been great to talk with you, and we really appreciate your time and appearing on Served Up. Bridget and I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
My pleasure. Congratulations on the podcast, and keep going. We need great podcasts in wine. So my hat's off to you both.
Thank
Amen.
you, Karen.
Thank you.
Wish you some great health and a lot of peace. Cheers.
Cheers back.
Thanks for listening. Served Up is brought to you by Southern Glazer's Wine and Spirits. Produced by Zunu.online. Music by We Killed the Lion can be found on Spotify. Make sure to subscribe to be notified of our future Served Up episodes. Cheers.